Hello everyone and welcome back to the coziest corner of YouTube, the RPG Radio. I'll be your forever fanciful host with buttered toast, Winback. Today's grimdawn build is part 3 of the Deathly Dervish build, and this video will be focused on finishing out our devotion tree, the final mythical relic, Scourge, and important components / augments with a bunch of gear upgrades that you'll get in elites or through the method of crafting. If you haven't watched the first 2 videos in this series, then I recommend checking those out first. Those 2 videos will get you acclimated to the build all the way down from level 1 up until now. Each video in this series talks about specific power spikes and tries to focus in on small things that might get overlooked in some of my single episode build videos. So, with all that being said, we've done enough lubing up, so let's slide right into all the stuff that you're really here for. Abilities haven't gotten much attention since our first video, but this time around there is some pretty important things I want to call out because you might not know where those points need to go. This build is going to have a lot of buttons if you want it to, so making sure that your ability points don't clog up that skill bar will eventually be something that you have to pay attention to. For that reason, you'll want to start by maxing out Presence of Virtue. You remember that super cool looking passive ability that you got for playing an Oathkeeper? Well, it actually gives you a hefty chunk of offensive ability. Since we're heading into the higher difficulties, the ability to land crits is more and more necessary, and the only way to do that is by having extra high offensive ability. Presence of Virtue gives you retaliation of the physical variety as well, which is never a bad thing when you're rocking the old Oathkeeper. After you finish Presence of Virtue, you'll want to make sure that Ring of Steel finally starts scaling up with Vire's Might. Since we're reducing the cooldown of this ability and increasing its crit damage, we want it to do more damage on a base level. Now, you don't want to hard max this bad boy just yet because it is very easy to over-rely on it and burn through your energy bar insanely fast. Once you hit about 10 points on Ring of Steel, go ahead and let the pot simmer for a while. When your Ring of Steel pot is getting nice and tender, flip on over to the Shadow Strike ability. We're only going to look at 2 masteries for this ability, however, and base Shadow Strike does not matter as much as Nightfall and Nadala's Justifiable Ends. As a matter of fact, Nightfall is the most important part of this ability. Since Nightfall gives Shadow Strike an AoE and a ton of cold / frostburn damage, you want to get this up to at least 7 or 8 points. We cap out at 12, so definitely going over 50% of the way isn't ever going to be a bad thing to do. The reason we're putting any points into Justifiable Ends at all is not for the damage, however. To be fair, if we were a more Shadow Strike focused build, this would be at the top of the list in priority, but the only thing we really need from this modifier is the cooldown reduction. 5 points is all it takes, and 5 points shaves off 0.5 seconds from the cooldown. Now, the difference between 3.5 and 3 seconds might seem ridiculous, but think about it like a new haircut. It's long, it hangs in your eyes, and it's starting to smell a little ripe. Once it's trimmed, you can see you're looking stylish and you feel the change when you catch a glimpse in the mirror. Never underestimate a good haircut. You'll also want to apply the same logic to Tectonic Shift, which is the modifier for Vire's Might. If Nadala's Justifiable Ends is a quick trip around the block for a touch-up to your hair, then Tectonic Shift is a haircut on bath salts. This one is a full 10 points that you are going to need into Tectonic Shift, and that is going to give you not only an additional 3 meters of distance to the ability, but it's going to give you a full second off the cooldown. Vire's Might at level 18 has a 3.6 second cooldown, and we knocked that down to 2.6, which is frankly pretty shocking when you consider all that the ability is doing for this build. Vire's Might is the pinnacle of what we are going for. It is mobility, it is a nuke, and it is going to activate a ton of devotions that deal lots of damage for us. So, having that down to what is basically a 2.5 second cooldown is a disgusting level of power added to the ability. Without diving super hard into all the math, the basic principle is the more that we use the ability, the more chance we have to reset it with our monster infrequent, the Warsword of Alchemos. When it resets, you're pretty much doubling, tripling, or even quadrupling the damage it does, depending on how lucky you can get. Every time it resets, you're going to cast it immediately again, and watch the damage go up like crazy. This also leads to an insane amount of effectiveness from our Leviathan devotion, which is another very important part of this build, coming along in a little bit later in this video. Now, there are a few other honorable mentions in the ability department that will require some points from you. Number 1 is going to be your phantasmal armor, and it is pretty easy why that is important to us. That's the energy absorbed from enemy spells and the armor, along with the pierce resistance and the reduction to freeze and petrify. Easy stats, easy passive, get some points into it. You don't have to max it all the way out. After that, you'll want to drop a few more points into Pneumatic Burst, because if you'll remember, Pneumatic Burst is essentially a passive ability with a button tax. Pneumatic Burst is also going to give you a large chunk of offensive ability. You just have to remember to keep that button pressed as often as possible and make sure that the passive doesn't run out. You got a 2-minute window to keep that thing going though, so it shouldn't be difficult for anybody to make sure they're not missing out on all the positives from Pneumatic Burst. Don't forget as well to put a few points into Shadow Dance. Getting this up to about level 7 with or without items is really all that you need up until you get to Ultimate, where we'll definitely want to have this maxed out, but for the time being, about 16% to 15% chance to avoid melee and projectile attacks is gonna do just fine for what we're after. But there you have it. That is everything that we really need for ability. If you haven't caught up to what the Grim Tools has listed, there is where all the points go. You can make sure to follow along with that if you want to be right down to the letter exactly the same as I am, or you can feel out what is good for you on the other end. One other thing that you may have noticed while watching the video that is different from the last one in relation to our abilities is that Amarasta's Blade Burst is no longer part of the build. There is a reason for that, and the reason simply being that it wasn't doing the right amount of damage for the amount of commitment it was going to take for points going into Ultimate. So we've removed that from the build entirely, replaced it with some new abilities, and added a whole lot more buttons to our hotbar with some gear. That being said, let's move on. We've got a lot more to go over, and it's going to make much more sense once we get to the end. That being said, I will kick off the devotions for you here because I'm sure that's what everybody is waiting on bated breath for. Now, just like I said earlier, all of these are laid out in full on the Grim Tools link down in the description below if you want to follow along 100% of the way. If you have your own devotions that you like through your build, through copying this one, feel free to stick with them. These are just which ones that worked best for me and the path that I needed to get to Leviathan, as well as Amatok and Kraken. So, in the last video, you'll remember that we were about halfway there and we ended on the devotion Murmur, Mistress of Rumors. With Murmur out of the way, we still have quite a few points needed before we can get to Leviathan, so let's pick it up right there. Now, one of my absolute favorite devotions in the entire page is Behemoth, and this one is available as soon as you complete Murmur. It's actually going to be available at just about the same time, since they require the same type of affinity, which is your Order, Eldritch, and Chaos, which is your blue, green, and pink, and Behemoth actually requires that you have fewer of these than Murmur. So if you are at the point of your gameplay experience that you are dying more often than you prefer, go ahead and pick up Behemoth first, because this one is a mostly defense-oriented devotion, and it is geared for keeping us alive. When you pick up Behemoth, you are going to require 6 points in total, but you can get the activatable ability for this bad boy pretty quick. Only 3 points in will get you a nice new ability called Giant's Blood, and that is a 15% chance that when you are hit, you will get 20% of your health back, along with a flat 1200 health on top of that, and a whole bunch of health regen per second. Right now, I've got it at level 20, which is about 600 health regen per second. That is pretty crazy, given that we're just over 10,000 health with this build. All of that in mind, you're also going to be getting base health regen from this devotion. It's going to give you flat health, about 300 for just 1 point. You're going to get increased healing effects. You'll get a percentage increase to health, as well as flat armor, and increase to health regeneration by about 80%. This is going to have some effects for pets as well, just in case you ever decide you're going to go test out your own pet build and not even bother with this one. Remember, Behemoth is very, very good at keeping those guys alive by giving them some good defensive stats of their own. This is also incredibly helpful for those characters who are not using things like shields or two-handed weapons with a lot of defense-oriented abilities in their kits. If you are playing something like a two-handed melee wielder just like this build, Behemoth is going to come in clutch way more often than not. The next two devotions we're going to talk about are going to lead you directly into Leviathan. Now, these two are rather unassuming, but they do, again, have lots of passive stats that are going to be very helpful for your build. No activatable abilities, unfortunately, so they're a little bit snoozeville, but that being said, Scholar's Light is the first one that you'll need, and this is going to give you 4 Eldritch points to get you your Eldritch prerequisite for Leviathan, getting you past 13, and the next is going to be Empty Throne, which will give you 5 of the Ascendant to get you your prerequisite for the 13 required to get up to Leviathan. Now let's talk about the stats themselves coming off of these two devotions. Scholar's Light is going to first off give you a small bump to elemental damage, and that in and of itself isn't great. We only get 15% increase, and since we're mainly focusing on cold, only a third of this is really effective for us. Since it's elemental, I mean, the other two are a freebie anyway, so the second tier of Scholar's Light is going to give you physique, defensive ability, and elemental resistance. Elemental resistance is only 8%, but considering that is 8% into 3 different categories of resistance, that is an incredibly useful stat. And then lastly, you are going to get yet another bump to your elemental damage and 8% aether resistance, but most importantly, you are going to get a small bump to your energy regen per second. It's only 2.5, but really at this point, every little bit that you can put into that stat, along with energy leech or energy absorbed from enemy spells, is going to keep your energy bar nice and thick while you cast tons and tons of abilities to clear out room after room of big trashy mobs. After that, though, with Empty Throne does have a couple of wasted stats again for pets, but is ultimately a very, very strong devotion. Firstly, you're going to get a flat defensive ability bump along with a slow resistance. You're also getting pierce resistance of about 8% from this devotion, 10% chaos resistance, and a resistance that is sorely lacked in a lot of devotions, gear, what have you, reduced stun duration. You get actually 25% reduced stun duration from just 1 point into Empty Throne, and that is for you and any pets that you have if you're going for a pet build. This stat is incredibly good to have built up because being stunned in Ultimate is basically a death sentence. If you don't have this maxed out at 80, you are in for a very bad time. There are very few things that will give you this resistance, and this devotion is one of those rare things. Lastly though, you'll get another 10% Aether resistance, and you get a 25% reduced freeze duration too. All of that stuff transfers over to pets yet again, but Empty Throne, almost pure defensive ability just for you and just for your survivability. There is no reason not to have this unless you are looking specifically at something more offense oriented. I don't know why you'd want to do that, because this thing is just built to keep you alive. That being said, with those two out of the way, we have finally unlocked the best devotion for our class, which is the Leviathan. Leviathan is one of the outer constellations, and it is pure magic for anybody focused on a cold damage build. I've heard lots and lots of people say that this has been nerfed, and to some extent, that's fine. I think it does enough damage for what I'm after, and it is probably one of the cooler looking devotions in the entire game. So if you are a visual player like I am, that is going to be a very happy, fun time for you. This is also going to replace Vire's Might as the activatable from Murmur and her ability, so you are going to switch out your Q and your R, because Leviathan is going to take over Vire's Might, and Murmur, the Mistress of Rumors, is now going to take hold of your metal mobility option, which is your Glyph of the Northern Ram. That second charge that we do after we hit a Vire's Might, that is now going to be attuned to Murmur's ability instead. So, all that being said, let's talk about Leviathan. With your first point, you're going to get a flat cold damage increase as well as a buff to all cold damage, and that is just the tip of the iceberg. With point number 2, you're getting increases to physique and an 8% increase to health, which is pretty big considering that we need to have a big health pool for a lot of our defensive abilities to take effect. At number 3, you're going to get a 10% increase to your entire energy bar, 60 defensive ability, and increased energy regen of 20%. Like I've been mentioning all the way up into this video, your energy bar can run out very quickly with this build, so having good regen and having a very good pool to pull from to begin with is very important, and Leviathan is all sorts of helpful when it comes to that. At point number 4, you're getting 20 pierce resistance, 20 vitality resistance, and the ever elusive 5% physical resistance, meaning that in Ultimate, this single devotion point is going to be unbelievably helpful in your defensive area. Now, at this point, you are at a 3-pronged fork in the road, but we all know which path you're going to take. You're going to go right up the middle and activate the Leviathan's ability called Whirlpool. Whirlpool has a 30% chance on attack to unleash a big torrent of icy water directly underneath the foes that you are dashing through your Vire's Might. This is also going to activate from your volcanic stride, so all of that carpet of fire that you leave behind you with only that single point that we have into the ability has the opportunity to kick in that 30% chance to activate Whirlpool. While you are doing this, anytime that you come across a boss or a hero enemy or anybody with a very big health pool that likes to stand very still, you will dump tons and tons and tons of whirlpools right on top of their head, increasing your damage by quite a bit. Now, Whirlpool itself has a 2-second skill recharge and a 6-second duration, so at any given point you can have 3 of these on top of a single enemy until they run out and start refreshing each other. They are incredibly easy to activate with Vire's Might because Vire's Might stays on the field for so long and you can activate it so often. This also has a 3.5 meter radius, which is the whirlpool that is, comes with 420 cold damage at a base, 340 frostburn damage over 2 seconds, and a 40% slow for those same 2 seconds. Now at level 15 is where the 420 and the 340 frostburn and cold damage kick in, but with any amount of use of this ability, you will see it happen very, very often. Because Whirlpool has such a short cooldown, you're going to be dealing a lot of damage with it, and because it's on such a reliable ability, it is going to pop off incredibly often. With it being targeted on the heftier enemies as the game goes on, because only the guys who can live through most of your initial salvo of burst damage are going to get hit with that Whirlpool. It's going to concentrate on them because they're going to be the only guys left around still to get hit by it, and it really helps to shred them all down. Those last 2 prongs of Leviathan, however, are going to be another flat increase to your cold damage along with 100% buff to the cold damage in general, and then on the other prong you are going to get a flat increase to your frostburn damage with a frostburn increase of 100% as well, and this prong comes with a 3% maximum raise to your cold resistance. So you will be efficiently overmaxed with this ability in at least your cold resistances. Leviathan is the best part in the devotion tree for this build, but there are a couple others on the opposite side of things that will give it a run for its money as a solid silver and bronze place. Now, even though both of these devotions will be pretty close to Leviathan in effectiveness, you can also get them much earlier in your devotion tree journey if you prefer. You are not going to be able to complete Amatok entirely, and Kraken will take up 5 points as well. So it's up to you if you want to get the 2 of these before Leviathan, but you do have the opportunity to pick up Leviathan first, which in my opinion is the better idea because Leviathan is much more consistent and much more active. However, that being said, we'll start off with Amatok, the Spirit of Winter. The Amatok devotion is going to start out by buffing your cold damage with the first point, and the second point is going to give you a % health increase of 6% along with some defensive ability. So much like Leviathan, Amatok has some very similar stats for all of our cold build adventurers out there. After that, you'll want to go to the right of the fork and pick up the next point, giving you an increase to frostburn damage along with offensive ability. That is always a good thing to have the further that you get in the game. Like I said earlier, making sure that you can crit is going to be very important, not only for your build and for your damage, but in order for the Amatok ability to work. Blizzard is going to activate 100% of the time that you get a critical attack. It has a 3.2 skill recharge at level 20, and it hits in about a 6.5 meter area. This is where you're going to watch your Shadow Strike and your Nightfall upgrades really show their value, because when your Shadow Strike hits enemies in that AoE, you are going to get quite a few opportunities to activate this ability. When you hit with an AoE, you have multiple opportunities based on the enemies that you're hitting to crit. And when you crit, 100% of the time you will drop a blizzard in a big AoE around them. Now, Grimdawn, the way that the crit system works is that every enemy has a defensive ability compared to your offensive ability. So what that means is that even though you are diving into a big group of bad guys, you can still manage to crit any of them in the AoE of your Nightfall, especially if there are ones with much lower defensive ability compared to others with higher defensive ability. Even if you were to Shadow Strike on someone who physically cannot be crit, if the Nightfall AoE hits someone with a very low defensive ability and crits off of that, the Blizzard will come down, dealing 16% weapon damage, anywhere from 300 to 400 cold damage, with a big chunk of frostburn damage and an opportunity to freeze and slow everything that is hit. Blizzard is an incredibly powerful ability, and the activation of it is much easier with the offensive ability that we've been building up to, along with the AoE that comes off of our Shadow Strike, to get the absolute maximum efficiency out of these two abilities together. Don't forget as well that we do have the cooldown reduction going for Shadow Strike, so this means that we can fire that thing off so often we should be dropping blizzards all over the place. And in this part of the video, you can see them raining down like it is the first snow of the season. Now, there are 2 more points that you'll want to spend on Amatok, and these are going to go along the left fork. We're not going to go for the point straight up, which is the health and defensive ability. If you would like to take points out of previous constellations to get to that one, it's probably worth it depending on the needs that you have and the gear that you have in your playthrough. But for the time being, the left arm of this devotion is going to do all that you would get up the middle and then some. So the first point on the left side is going to give you a buff to cold and frostburn damage, and you're going to get a flat health increase of 250 health. On top of that, you'll go 1 point further to get a flat bump to your frostburn damage over 3 seconds, as well as buffs to cold and frostburn damage yet again. This is the point where you can make the decision if you'd like to, because this arm ends in damage, but if you wanted to take that out and go for increased health and defensive ability instead, that's completely within the realm of understandable, because having more health, having more not dead meter is always a good thing. The reason we can't fill this devotion out entirely though is because our other devotion requires all 5 points, and that is built specifically for two-handed builds, whether they are melee or ranged. Kraken requires 5 points, and all 5 of those are going to provide you some very, very big stats for what they're going to do. So to kick it off, you're going to put 1 point in for 50% to all damage. Nice and easy, really fancy way to start off the devotion. From here, you have a 4-way tie for what you want to get started with, and I opted for the option of health, attack speed, and casting speed. That is the far left point to put in. After that, we did it yet again with a point right next to it for another 250 health, attack speed, and casting speed. After that, you can get another 70% to all damage with 5% to move speed, or you can get 15% increase to your crit damage with 4% physical resistance. If you've been keeping track of everything that we've talked about thus far, you know that all of these stats are incredibly good for a two-handed build, and there is a reason that Kraken is built specifically for people using two-handed weapons. All of this stuff is fantastic, and the attack speed is going to do nothing but buff your righteous fervor as we get further in the game, letting you use that more often, which is going to help keep you alive when you are not flinging yourself in and out of huge mobs of enemies, dealing all sorts of cold damage, firing off whirlpools, and generally being a snowy mess. That's it for the devotions though. Hopefully you can follow along and pick those all up. You will want to take 1 point out of your Chaos Crossroads devotion from early on and put that into either Amatok or Kraken. But remember, having that little increase early on, you can pull that point out because the big devotions in Leviathan and Behemoth and Murmur do not rely on that point any longer. So go ahead, pop it out of there, put it in something more useful in the outer ring, and have yourself a good time. That being said, let's talk about some gear, because there is a little bit that you can pick up at this point at level 75 in Elite that will be a big boon to your build. Number one, the most easily achievable, as long as you have the blueprint for it, is going to be the Scourge Relic. Scourge does give you cold and flat vitality damage. Both of those are the damage types that you need with this build. Vitality is much more minor as far as we're concerned, but it is still something that will happen upon quite a bit. You'll also convert part of your attack damage to health. You'll get buffs to cold and frostburn damage with this relic. You'll get an increase of 15% damage to undead, which is incredibly helpful when fighting off ethereals, zombies, of the like, and you get percent increases to both physique and spirit. Both of those very, very strong attributes. Physique for keeping you alive, and spirit for helping you do more damage and having more energy. You also get a very nifty ability with Scourge, and that is called Scourge Strike. You can see it down here on my A button. It is the third ability from the left on the hotbar, and this is a single activatable ability. You have to target a single enemy with it, but when you do this, you will cleave in an area to hit multiple enemies, and you are going to deal 425% weapon damage along with cold and vitality damage, and you are going to convert 24% of that attack into health. After all of that is done, you'll still be doing frostburn damage and vitality decay damage over 3 seconds, along with a freeze of the target for 1.5 seconds. It is also going to convert 100% of physical damage into cold damage. My specific completion bonus came along with even more offensive ability in the form of a percentage increase, so Scourge is 100% the one that you'll want for this build to allow you a big finishing blow with your two-handed weapon once all is said and done after your Vire's Mites, your ramming speed, your ascension, your Ring of Steel, everything is still done and the boss is still standing. You'll pull out your relic ability and cleave them in two. The reason that we started this part of the video with that relic is because Scourge is available right at level 60. So while you are climbing up to the power spike of level 75, which is where you're going to unlock the ability to use a lot of these things, Scourge is going to be usable up to that point, and it is going to be making enemy health bars much easier to deal with while you are building up to your monster infrequence. The good news about farming the Warsword and Ilgor's Eternal Vigil all over again is that the normal versions of these two items have such an aggressive buff to your build that you can hold on to those normal versions all the way up until you get the replacements, and you can equip them at level 75. So that being said, you do want to keep farming those skeleton keys. You want to make sure that you are diving headfirst into the Steps of Torment dungeon as often as possible until you pick these two up, because they do still have a very big impact on your build. They come with a large power spike. The Warsword itself is available at level 70, so once you hit 70 you can equip the Warsword, and the Vigil, which is your metal, will take you until level 75 to use. So you can get them both on a single clear, and if you're lucky like me, the first run through the Steps of Torment during Elite will drop both of these for you, and you can just say goodbye to that entire dungeon if you want to, or you can continue farming it because it is full of all sorts of gear that could be pretty awesome for our boy. That said, these are the two big ones that you'll need from the Steps of Torment. They're going to do exactly the same things that they did in their normal versions. They're just going to come along with some extra stats that are going to make them even more effective. That being things like offensive ability, elemental resistance on the Warsword, and then for the Eternal Vigil, you'll be getting offensive ability and more resistances to pierce and bleeding. Obviously, you still want to shoot for good rolls with these items, so if you've got something that looks a little bit on the low end, feel free to pull it up on the Grim tools. I've got what they can roll for you here, and keep running that dungeon if you feel like you need to. Honestly, the ability changes that these two items bring to the table for your Pneumatic Burst and your Vire's Might are big enough that that alone should be enough to carry you all the way up to level 94, where you will get the ultimate versions of both of these items. There will be more gear to talk about in the final video for this build once we get into ultimate, but I do want to touch on components and augments for the build as well, because those have some pretty significant impacts on how you can play. Number one, you'll want to build the Seal of Knights. This is the component you will attach to your war sword, and it comes with an ability all of its own on top of its really good passive stats. So the passive stats are going to give you flat cold, it's going to give you buffs to pierce, cold, and frostburn, it's going to convert further physical damage to cold damage and give you a big chunk of offensive ability. On top of that though, it will give you the ability to hurl a fan of ice darts, daggers, spiky things at your enemies with 0 cooldown. If you have run out and you have been incredibly unlucky in getting the cooldowns reset for your dashes, this ability can really deal some damage right up in the face of whatever enemy you have got it targeted at. These are, again, big fan that you will throw out. They are ranged, so you can deal damage from a safe position, unlike the melee goodness that we are used to. We are also using a number of augments to help up our resistances, and that is going to be number one, a Gazer Eye applied to a ring, a Slith Venom applied to a ring as well, Corpse Fiend Tentacle applied to our amulet. We're also using potent Black Steel Powder to increase some offensive ability applied to our war sword, and from there you will further unlock your augments through reputation for vendors. So once you get to tier 4, which will be in the next video, you will be able to use armor augments, which will help fill in the holes your resistances may have in elite that you can suffer through and still do well, but once you get to ultimate, you will need to have maxed out and potentially overmaxed at that point. Ultimate is very unforgiving in the damage that you will take, but that is for next time, and we'll talk about it then. As of right now, that is it for this video, everyone. Thank you so much for following along, if indeed you still are, and I will catch you all next time.